Think you could survive without Wi-Fi, grocery stores, or running water? Spoiler alert, medieval peasants would laugh at you. While most of us panic when the power goes out for an hour, people in the Middle Ages mastered survival with nothing but dirt, smoke, and pure grit. They didn't have smartphones, but they had tricks, genius ones, like using moss to heal wounds or hiding food under fake rot to fool invaders. Some of these forgotten hacks are more effective than our modern solutions. Others are downright shocking, like fermenting poison into food or tossing hornet bombs at raiders. So, what did they know that we don't? And why are we only now rediscovering it? This isn't a romanticized history lesson. It's a reality check. Because when the system breaks down, medieval logic might just save your modern life. Stick around, one of these 13 survival tricks might be the key to your future. If you think survival means a full pantry, a Swiss Army knife, and a backup battery for your phone, congratulations. You wouldn't last a single day in medieval Europe. Back then, survival wasn't about prepping for a weekend camping trip. It was about staying alive when winter meant starvation, wounds meant infection, and every village had its own brand of disaster. Life didn't offer safety nets. It threw you into the wild with a shovel, a hunk of bread, and maybe, just maybe, a superstition that worked. And yet, despite the plague, famine, and war, people survived. Not by accident, but because they passed down cunning survival tricks that modern folks wouldn't even think to try. Let's start with hay insulation. No central heating? No problem, if you knew what to do. Medieval peasants in colder climates packed hay between the walls of their cottages to trap heat. They'd even sew hay into mattress covers to create what was basically a DIY thermal bed. It wasn't pretty, but it was wildly effective. In fact, hay-stuffed bedding could retain body heat so well that it often doubled the survivable indoor temperature during deep winter nights. Fast forward to today, we have thermal curtains, double glazing, and space heaters. But guess what? In recent off-grid experiments, hay-packed walls still outperform cheap modern insulation in heat retention. That's right, straw might beat your space heater if the power's out. And then there's boiling water trickery. While modern folks might obsess over bottled water purity, medieval people developed a simple, low-fuel way to sterilize water without wasting firewood. Instead of a long boil, they'd bring it just to a rolling simmer, enough to kill off pathogens, then let it cool in sealed clay jugs. Combined with natural filtering using sand or charcoal layers, this trick made even ditch water drinkable. Some monasteries even used woven cloth to filter out leeches. Yes, literal leeches. Here's the kicker. Studies today show that a 3-minute rolling boil kills nearly all common waterborne bacteria, just as medieval monks knew by practice. No high-tech filters, no UV pens, just clay, heat, and patience. But survival wasn't just about heat and hydration. In the Middle Ages, body odor was a battlefield, and not for the reason you think. Baths were rare, sure. But people weren't as filthy as Hollywood likes to pretend. Instead, they weaponized herbs. One smart trick: sewing crushed lavender, thyme, or rosemary into linen undergarments. Not only did this mask scent, but these herbs were mildly antimicrobial, reducing skin infections and lice. Some even dabbed vinegar on cloths soaked with sage as a medieval wet wipe. Not glamorous, but incredibly effective when soap was scarce and disease was everywhere. Today, we spend billions on deodorants and antibacterial soaps. But ask any wilderness survivalist, if you're in the wild for weeks, a sprig of thyme in your socks might save your skin. Literally. Speaking of clever, have you ever wondered how medieval folks kept meat from rotting, without fridges, ice, or vacuum seals? One word: fat sealing. It sounds medieval because it is. After cooking meat, people would pour hot animal fat over it in ceramic pots, sealing it off from air. This formed a solid layer that blocked bacteria, keeping the meat edible for weeks, even months in cold weather. This method, called potting, was so reliable it made its way into royal kitchens. The modern equivalent: canning, just minus the metal and pressure valves. And the taste? Probably better than most gas station jerky. But sometimes, survival came down to the kind of trick that'd make Bear Grylls proud. In parts of northern Europe, peasants used moss as a bandage. Not just any moss, sphagnum moss, which happens to be naturally absorbent and acidic, making it a near-sterile dressing. During World War I, doctors rediscovered the same moss for field hospitals. But medieval people had already figured it out centuries earlier, often packing it with honey or wine for extra antibacterial punch. Modern gauze may be convenient, but in a blackout or deep wilderness, moss and honey are still shockingly effective. In fact, recent studies have confirmed that sphagnum moss reduces bacterial load in wounds comparably to some commercial antiseptics. Still, perhaps the most mind-blowing trick of all was one we almost mocked into extinction: the compost toilet pit. Sure, it sounds gross. But the medieval version of an eco-toilet was more than just a hole in the ground. Smart villagers dug double-chamber pits. While one side composted human waste into fertilizer over months, the other stayed in use. They rotated sides every season and covered the pits with straw to reduce smell and flies. The payoff: free, pathogen-reduced fertilizer that helped them grow food even during lean years. Compare that to today's chemical-heavy septic systems or the rising cost of fertilizer, and suddenly, the medieval poop pit looks like a genius design. The ingenuity doesn't stop there. Ever thought a cabbage leaf could save your life? For women giving birth, midwives often placed chilled cabbage leaves on swollen breasts to ease inflammation. And it wasn't just folklore. Cabbage has anti-inflammatory compounds still used in some folk medicine today. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was the difference between agony and relief for countless mothers without access to pain meds. And don't get us started on their foraging expertise. Medieval peasants could name, and use, dozens of wild plants that modern people wouldn't dare touch. Nettles, dandelions, burdock, chickweed, foods we now treat like weeds, were key survival crops rich in iron and vitamins. Dandelion root, for example, was dried and ground into a bitter coffee substitute. Not tasty, but in lean months, it kept energy up and bowels moving. In fact, modern foragers and bushcrafters are relearning what medieval villagers already knew. Nature feeds you, but only if you learn her language. And unlike us, they didn't have a smartphone app to ID plants. Just grandmothers and sheer necessity. By now, it's clear, medieval people weren't lucky to survive. They were resourceful, observant, and willing to test weird tricks that worked. Sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of tradition, but always with survival in mind. And as the threats got deadlier, their tricks got stranger. Surviving a medieval winter was one thing, but staying alive in the face of hunger, disease, and social chaos? That required more than hay-stuffed bedding and cabbage compresses. As we dive deeper, it becomes obvious. Survival back then wasn't just physical. It was tactical. Let's start with hunger. Famine hit hard and often, sometimes lasting for years. And when the granaries emptied and livestock dropped dead, people had to get creative, fast. Enter the acorn flour trick. Yes, acorns. The bitter, often overlooked nuts we rake up in suburban yards today were a survival staple. The catch: you couldn't just eat them raw. They're loaded with tannins that can cause vomiting, cramps, or worse. But medieval people knew to leach acorns in cold water for days, sometimes burying them near rivers or soaking them in running streams. Once dried and ground, they'd mix the flour with barley or oat flour to stretch dwindling supplies. It tasted terrible, but it filled bellies. And get this, during World War II, parts of Europe returned to acorn flour as an emergency food. That same medieval trick helped modern populations survive blockades and rationing. But food tricks weren't just for the hungry, they were also for the hunted. Disease, after all, was the real predator in medieval Europe. Take the onion and garlic poultice. When plague rolled into town, and it did often, people scrambled to protect themselves any way they could. In some regions, families hung garlands of onions and garlic in doorways, hoping their pungency would block bad air. But others took it further, mashing the two into a paste and smearing it onto boils or infected skin. Laughable, maybe. But garlic contains allicin, a proven antimicrobial, and onion juice was used in early surgical dressings well into the 18th century. These weren't just folk remedies, they were proto-antibiotics. Compare that to today's over-reliance on pharmaceuticals. If modern supply chains broke down, how many of us would know that crushed garlic might actually delay an infection? And what about psychological survival? How people coped when the world collapsed around them? In rural villages, story circles weren't just entertainment. They were mental health tools, stress relievers, and information networks all in one. When sickness, war, or famine isolated communities, Gathering around the hearth to swap legends, ghost tales, or moral parables kept morale from shattering. Elders passed on cautionary tales, often laced with practical survival tips disguised as fables. Children learned not to wander into woods not because of wolves, but because Old Bramblehook would snatch them. That fear kept them safe from wild boars, brigands, and getting lost. In modern terms, think of it as group therapy meets public service announcement without the PowerPoint slides. But survival also meant reading the land, and this is where medieval folks were eerily good. One brilliant trick was watching the birds, literally. If birds went silent, it usually meant danger, a predator nearby, a storm coming, or even, yes, an approaching army. Some herders in mountainous areas trained their kids to track bird behavior as early warning systems. Ravens circling low. That meant a carcass nearby, possibly plague. Sparrows vanishing. Brace for weather. This isn't superstition. Ecologists today know that birds go quiet before earthquakes and predators. But medieval people didn't need data, they paid attention. Unlike us, they weren't glued to screens. Their weather app had wings and feathers. Another sharp trick: oil in water fire alerts. In monasteries and wealthy homes, where candles and hearths posed major fire risks, caretakers floated a thin layer of oil in shallow bowls of water. If a fire broke out nearby, the air currents would disrupt the oil's surface long before smoke reached the nose. This gave precious seconds to douse flames or grab buckets. Not perfect, but it saved more than one wooden structure from going up in flames. It's the medieval version of a smoke alarm, silent, analog, and oddly beautiful. But not every trick was passive. Some were bold, even defiant. Like the practice of fungus armor. No, seriously. In the forests of Central Europe, peasants who couldn't afford leather sometimes cured thick slabs of amadou, a soft fungus that grows on trees, and layered it between linen and boiled bark to make crude chest padding. The result wasn't ironclad, but it did absorb impact from blunt weapons and even slingshot stones. It was the body armor of the poor, and while knights had their chainmail, these fungal DIYers had something far more accessible. Think of it like medieval Kevlar, grown in the woods. Here's another wild one: fermentation as preservation and detox. Today, we love our kombucha and sourdough. But for medieval survivors, fermentation wasn't trendy, it was life-saving. Unripe or borderline spoiled vegetables were often fermented in brine to kill off harmful microbes. People even fermented mildly poisonous plants to neutralize their toxins, rendering them edible. In monasteries, monks used wine not just to preserve fruits, but to sanitize them. No bleach, no refrigeration, just biology and patience. It's estimated that fermented foods made up nearly 40% of the peasant diet in some regions during winter. Imagine if your fridge broke and you had to survive solely on what you could ferment. Most of us would starve. A medieval peasant, they'd just burp a barrel and dig in. And when it came to signaling for help, without phones, horns, or even flags, villagers relied on one of the oldest survival systems in history: smoke codes. If a village spotted invaders or fire, they'd burn a mix of green leaves and animal dung. This produced thick, colored smoke that could be seen miles away. Each region had its own system. 1 plume meant danger, 2 meant fire, 3 might mean disease. The system was crude but effective, medieval pager systems, if you will. Today, we rely on satellites and 5G. But if the grid failed, most of us wouldn't even know which way smoke drifts in the wind, let alone how to use it to signal distress. And finally, there was the hidden seed cache. In times of invasion or famine, rural families often buried sealed pots of seeds in waterproof clay jars near landmarks only they would recognize. It was a last resort trick. If crops failed or soldiers stole their food, they could unearth their future in the form of barley, rye, or beans. Some of these caches have even been found by archaeologists, perfectly preserved, centuries later. It wasn't just smart, it was legacy survival. A backup plan written into the earth. As we peel back these layers of medieval cunning, it becomes clearer with each trick: these people weren't primitive. They were problem solvers, innovators, and hardened realists. They understood that nature doesn't forgive laziness, and that survival meant watching, learning, adapting, over and over. But not every trick was passed down. Some were buried, literally, and only now are we rediscovering them. So far, we've seen how medieval folks stayed warm, fed, and relatively disease-free with a surprising bag of tricks. But what happened when the system collapsed entirely? When your village burned, your livestock vanished, and the king's tax collector still came knocking. That's when survival tricks escalated, from clever to downright audacious. One such tactic was the smokehouse ruse. In times of war, when bandits or armies looted the countryside, peasants knew the first thing raiders looked for was food. So instead of hiding it, some made it look already stolen. They'd burn dung in their smokehouses to fill them with a wretched stench, rub meat with ash to dull its color, or even hang fake, rotting skins near the door to give the illusion everything had spoiled. Raiders, in a hurry and often half-starved themselves, wouldn't waste time digging further. The real supplies, buried in sealed barrels under pigsties or hidden inside haylofts, stayed untouched. It was medieval camouflage for your pantry. And the concept isn't far off from today's decoy safes or even anti-theft paint. When times get desperate, misdirection becomes survival. And speaking of deception, let's talk about bog butter. Yes, it sounds like a terrible skincare product, but it was genius. In Celtic and Norse regions, people buried large lumps of butter in peat bogs, not just to store it, but to preserve it for years. The anaerobic, cold, and acidic environment kept it edible far longer than any medieval pantry could. Some of this bog butter is still being dug up today, over 1,000 years old and still technically edible. That's how effective the trick was. And while butter might not seem like a survival item, in medieval life, it was currency. Fat meant calories. It meant barter power. It meant cooking fuel. In desperate times, one bog-preserved chunk could buy you a week of life. But let's crank the intensity up a notch. What if it wasn't just hunger, but exposure? If you were forced to flee into the wild with nothing, what then? Here enters the cloak as tent trick. Woolen cloaks in the Middle Ages weren't just fashion. They were survival gear. Thick, naturally water-resistant, and incredibly warm even when wet, a good cloak could double as a tent, a blanket, or even a stretcher. Seasoned travelers knew how to pin the edges over low tree branches or collapse under them like a cocoon. Today's ultralight camping tarps? Medieval folks had the same idea, just made from sheep and necessity. But survival sometimes meant surrendering dignity to practicality. Case in point, urine tanning. In hide-working villages, animal hides were softened using a mix of water and human urine, a free, readily available source of ammonia. But peasants took the method further. If they needed waterproof shoes or weather-resistant cloaks, they'd soak leather in this mix, then rub it with animal brains or fat to finish the treatment. Disgusting. Maybe. Effective. Extremely. These treated leathers resisted mold, repelled water, and lasted longer than untreated hide. And in winter, having dry feet could mean the difference between frostbite and functionality. It's a stark reminder. Survival doesn't care about your comfort zone. It cares if you live to see morning. Let's switch gears and look at how medieval folks handled extreme exhaustion, without coffee, energy drinks, or protein bars. The answer: birch sap and wild egg yolks. In Slavic and Nordic regions, spring foragers tapped birch trees for sap, a slightly sweet, mineral-rich liquid that functioned like an electrolyte drink. Mixed with raw egg yolk and a pinch of salt, it became a kind of medieval smoothie, ideal for those recovering from illness or preparing for hard labor. Peasants weren't pounding Red Bulls, but they understood how to fuel their bodies naturally. And modern nutritionists agree, birch sap contains antioxidants, potassium, and amino acids. Sometimes, the forest was a pharmacy. But even medicine had its improvised moments. Enter the spiderweb bandage. Yes, seriously. In various parts of Europe, from the Balkans to the British Isles, wounded farmers collected spiderwebs to pack into open wounds. The silky threads absorbed blood and, crucially, contained natural antifungal and antibacterial properties. Some even mixed it with vinegar or honey. Today, this might sound like desperation, but recent research confirms that spider silk has strong healing potential. In fact, scientists are studying it for future wound dressings. Medieval people weren't guessing, they were observing what worked. Now imagine you're a peasant, hiding from marauders. You need food, but lighting a fire could give away your location. What then? That's where the cold gruel method came in. Grain was boiled ahead of time and dried in thin sheets. In hiding, peasants rehydrated it with cold water, creating a bland but nutritious porridge, No fire, no smoke, no scent. They carried it in leather pouches, sometimes mixed with berries or herbs for flavor. It was portable, stealthy, and fast. Like a medieval MRE without the plastic pouch. And sometimes, survival depended on the natural world turning in your favor. Cue the bee trick. When under threat, some villagers kept small clay pots filled with wild bees or hornets near entrances. If raiders came, they'd toss the pots like biological grenades. The swarm would erupt in chaos, buying just enough time to flee or fight back. Bees. The medieval home security system. It sounds wild, but Roman soldiers did something similar centuries earlier, launching hornet nests at enemies. And if you've ever disturbed a hive, you know why it worked. Let's not forget the bread as medicine technique. Stale bread, especially sourdough, was sometimes applied to wounds, soaked in vinegar or wine, to draw out infection. Some monks even recommended using the heel of the bread, toasted and pulverized, mixed with egg white as a salve. It wasn't ideal. But when you're out of moss and spider silk, the crusty loaf on the shelf could still save your leg. And then there's the grave marker map. In regions prone to war or plague, families marked burial plots not just to honor the dead, but to hide valuables. Stones were arranged in coded positions. A tilted cross might indicate silver beneath. A certain number of pebbles on the right side could mean stored seed pots below. It was a GPS system for the desperate, if you knew the key. Some of these markers have led modern archaeologists to caches of tools, coins, even weapons buried centuries ago. It wasn't just mourning. It was mapping survival. As you can see, the deeper we go, the more radical the tricks become. It wasn't enough to just cope. Medieval survivors had to outsmart nature, invaders, and even their own rulers. What's most shocking? Many of these tricks still work, but they're buried under centuries of convenience. And just when you think it couldn't get any more resourceful, there's one final level of survival that's rarely talked about, the mental game. By now, it's crystal clear, surviving in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of grit. It was a full-time job of observation, trial and error, and passing down secrets that might literally save a family line. But what happens when those tricks collide with the brutal forces of plague, politics, and paranoia? That's when survival becomes legacy, and every move could echo for generations. Consider the impact of medieval quarantine codes. When the Black Death tore through Europe, villages didn't just pray and panic, they developed complex survival routines. In many regions, if one house was infected, neighbors would carve a mark into its door, often a circle with a cross, to warn others away. But some took it further. Entire villages created cordon boundaries, invisible lines around the perimeter guarded by locals armed with farm tools. Outsiders were turned away, or worse. One French village, Eymes in England, famously chose to seal itself off entirely during a later plague outbreak. Hundreds died inside, but their isolation stopped the disease from spreading. That's not just bravery. That's systematized survival. An early form of public health, built from desperation and raw logic. They didn't have microscopes, but they saw patterns, and they acted. Fast forward to modern pandemics, and you'll recognize eerie parallels. Masking, marking, distancing, isolating. But medieval folks figured it out without Zoom calls or WHO briefings. Their tools were chalk, guts, and the will to protect what little they had. And then there's the matter of survival against authority. Sometimes the greatest threat wasn't nature or disease, it was the state. In times of war or crushing taxation, peasants resorted to something called dead fielding. Fields were intentionally left unplanted and made to look barren, even salted around the edges to kill visible weeds. Why? To trick tax assessors or feudal lords into thinking the land was infertile, unworthy of grain quotas or conscription. Meanwhile, real crops were hidden behind tree lines or grown in sunken patches along riverbanks. It was agricultural camouflage, a dangerous game. If caught, punishment ranged from whipping to death. But if it worked, entire families could eat through a lean season unnoticed. It's not so different from today's economic loopholes and underground economies. When systems become predatory, the people get creative. But some survival methods had unintended consequences. One disturbing example, catcalling during plague waves. In an effort to stop disease, believed to be spread by demonic animals, many towns ordered the killing of stray cats. Church teachings sometimes fueled this, equating cats with witchcraft or moral decay. But fewer cats meant more rats, and more rats meant more fleas, and more plague. It's one of the darkest survival miscalculations in medieval history. Trying to survive, people wiped out their best pest control allies. It's a reminder that not every trick worked. Some backfired catastrophically. Still, knowledge didn't die with disaster. In fact, oral survival transmission became one of the most valuable tools of all. Old women, often called cunning folk or wise wives, were repositories of information. Which herbs soothed burns? Which mushrooms fed but didn't kill? When to plant, when to hide, when to run. They were walking manuals of survival. And unfortunately, this made them targets. As fear and superstition grew, especially in late medieval periods, many of these women were accused of witchcraft. Some were executed, others forced into silence, but not before passing down what they knew to daughters, apprentices, or sympathetic monks. This is where survival crossed into resistance. Keeping that knowledge alive, under threat of death, was the ultimate defiance, and much of what we now call folk wisdom is rooted in their whispered teachings. Even monks had their own survival tricks, particularly during sieges. In isolated monasteries, they created edible gardens disguised as flower beds, growing herbs and leafy greens between decorative plants to avoid suspicion from enemies watching from a distance. Some even kept secret fermentation cellars, where vinegars, wine, and preserved vegetables were hidden behind false walls. To this day, archaeologists are discovering hidden chambers in abbeys across Europe that were used not for worship, but for food storage, seed-keeping, and even underground escape tunnels. Monastic survival wasn't about faith alone. It was about foresight, engineering, and a deep understanding that a peaceful world wasn't guaranteed. Now let's look at a survival technique that seems almost too clever: mirror signaling using polished shields or metal trays. Used by scouts, hunters, and even kids trained to spot movement from afar, this was a rudimentary but effective way to communicate across distances, especially in forests or hills. The glint of light, flashed in rhythmic bursts, could relay warnings like, "Bandits nearby," or "Return home now." It wasn't as fast as a text, but it could span a mile or more on a clear day. What's wild? This trick is still used by some off-grid survivalists today, using mirrors or foil, but it traces back to medieval messengers with nothing more than sunlight and signal timing. Then there was the trick of embedded warning songs. Songs and chants weren't just entertainment, they were mnemonic tools for survival. Children learned verses that helped them identify poisonous plants, count safe steps near unstable bridges, or remember the timing of harvest cycles. In remote communities, these were sung at festivals, weddings, or even funerals, encoded survival data wrapped in tradition. Some of these melodies are still around today, their meanings half forgotten, but their purpose once deadly serious. And we can't ignore one of the boldest survival tactics of all: strategic migration. When all else failed, families packed up and left. But not randomly, often guided by oral maps, star patterns, or known water routes. Some had prearranged signals with neighboring villages. A cluster of marked trees meant safe to pass, while a broken cartwheel by a crossroads could mean bandits nearby. Medieval people didn't need GPS, they had folk signals and celestial navigation. Entire generations moved using these systems. And while not foolproof, they saved countless lives when staying meant starvation or slaughter. What emerges here isn't just a collection of tricks, it's a system. A decentralized, evolving, often fragile system of survival built from scraps, sweat, and memory. And while many of these tactics are long forgotten, a few linger on, in rituals, in habits, in the rhythms of rural life across Europe. But what if we stopped treating them like dusty curiosities, and started learning from them again? It's easy to look back at the Middle Ages and see only darkness, disease, death, superstition, war. But beneath that surface, buried in the muck and chaos, lies something much more impressive: resilience. Not the heroic kind sung in ballads or carved into statues. No, we're talking about the quiet, stubborn kind. The resilience of the woman who boiled weeds so her children could eat. Of the shepherd who read the sky like a scroll. Of the child who learned to recognize edible mushrooms before they learned to read. Survival in medieval times wasn't a single trick, it was a mindset. A muscle memory of generations who knew the world wouldn't take care of them, so they had to learn to do it themselves. And in a strange twist of fate, many of those hard-earned lessons are now being forgotten, right when we might need them again. Take seed saving, for example. For centuries, peasants meticulously selected and stored seeds not just for the next planting, but to improve the crop with each generation. Today, most of us couldn't identify wheat in a field, let alone know how to dry and store viable seed. We've traded control for convenience, and when systems fail, we panic. But the medieval mind expected systems to fail. It planned for it. That wasn't pessimism, it was strategy. Even in moments of joy, medieval people embedded survival into celebration. Harvest festivals weren't just parties, they were tests of who had enough stores to share, who could still dance after the lean season, who had the skill to brew strong cider or bake bread from scratch. Every toast was proof of another year survived. Compare that to modern life, where survival skills are treated like hobbies or TikTok trends. Fermenting sauerkraut? Niche. Foraging? Instagrammable. But for medieval people, it was life or death. And their knowledge wasn't niche, it was common sense. And here's a hard truth. Much of that knowledge was lost not because it didn't work, but because we stopped respecting the people who carried it. The industrial age replaced hand-me-down wisdom with machines. Schools devalued folk knowledge in favor of Latin grammar and classical rhetoric. Midwives were replaced by proper physicians. Herbalists were labeled quacks. Farmers became peasants again, backwards, poor, ignorant. But they weren't ignorant. They were survivors. And now, as climate shifts, supply chains wobble, and digital systems glitch, we're beginning to realize just how much we've forgotten. Or maybe, how much we never even learned. Some modern thinkers call this ancestral knowledge, the instinctive intelligence of those who lived close to the land, who saw patterns in the soil, the stars, the sicknesses. But in medieval Europe, it didn't feel like wisdom. It felt like necessity. A necessity that came at great cost. Because for every genius trick that saved lives, there were lives lost discovering it. Someone had to eat the wrong berry. Someone had to catch fire from the wrong kindling. Someone had to bleed out because they didn't know which moss stopped the flow. Every trick you've heard in this story was bought with risk, failure, and sometimes tragedy. That's why they were remembered. And that's why forgetting them now is such a strange kind of betrayal. Of course, we don't need to go full medieval. No one's suggesting we ditch plumbing and start sleeping in hay beds. But there's a powerful case for relearning what our ancestors practiced by necessity. Like how to build shelter from found materials. How to preserve food without a freezer. How to recognize when an animal is sick or when a cloud formation means hail. How to trade, barter, share. How to cope when things go very, very wrong. Because let's face it, comfort is a trap. It makes us believe we're immune to catastrophe. But ask any medieval peasant, there's no such thing. The village burns. The harvest fails. The Lord demands too much. And still, somehow, life goes on. If there's one message to take from these survival tricks, it's this: the human capacity to adapt is extraordinary. We may live in a world of artificial intelligence and instant delivery, but strip it all away, and we're not so different from the barefoot child kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds they hope will grow. Or the old woman boiling weeds into soup. Or the father hiding his last chunk of salted pork under floorboards because he knows what's coming. Survival, real survival, has never been about being the strongest. It's about being the cleverest, the most observant, the most willing to do the hard, dirty, unpopular thing if it means seeing another sunrise. And that's exactly what medieval people mastered. So maybe the challenge now isn't just to admire their genius from a distance, but to reawaken it. We live in a world where survival often means having the latest gear or watching the right tutorial. But for medieval people, it meant digging deep, into nature, into memory, into sheer human will. Their tricks weren't cute. They were brutal, brilliant, and born from real struggle. So maybe the next time your fridge breaks, your power's out, or life just throws you into chaos, you'll remember that cabbage can heal, moss can save, and a hunk of ash-covered meat might be the smartest thing you own. What survival trick surprised you the most? And which one would you actually try today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your modern take on medieval wisdom. And if you're into raw, real history like this, Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We've got plenty more forgotten genius coming your way. Because the past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be remembered.